Good day, all. This is Charles with the Exodus Logistics Learning Center, Dispatcher 101 training for beginners. Just want to give a little tidbit because I get questions about when talking to carriers, how to convince them to be their dispatcher, and then the carrier is giving you guys unrealistic numbers, right? So I'm going to open up a Word document and create a document real quick, share it with the screen, and when the carrier gives you their numbers and what they want, and when you're talking to the carriers, the truck drivers, the owner operators, um, what to share with them, right? So on this document, on this screen here that we're sharing, if it's showing here, got a blank piece of paper, right? So share that. So let's call it something here. Let's go to page layout, change the margins just so you can have it. Okay. Go back to home. So on this document, we're going to say, let's say you tell the carrier, the truck driver, the owner operator that you can gross them if they're not already grossing it, but between uh, 8 to 10,000 gross weekly, right? You can get them that. Okay, I want to gross 8 to 10,000 weekly. That's going to be based off of cents per mile and over the road miles, right? So if a carrier says that I want to be home every night, right? Home every night, unless they're under some kind of contract, dedicated lane in that particular area, home every night, it's going to be hard to do that. The more miles you drive, the greater the chance of you to generate um, 8 to 10 grand a week. They want to be home every night and they want to make $3 to $4 a mile, $3.50 to $4 a mile, right? So if they say that, it's like, okay, well, what do you want there? So cents per mile, let's say cents per mile, and let's say they want it between 350, well, let's say 250 to $3 a mile. I just throwing some numbers up here so you guys can kind of get a perspective on. And most carriers, the more money you make, let's say you drive, the truck driver drives, let's say they drive 5 days a week or 6 days a week, because they're trying to generate between over the road OTR. OTR is over the road, okay? Not local, not regional, but over the road, greater distances. So let's say that equals between 2,500 to 3,000 miles per week, okay? On either a 5 or 6 day work week, right? So these are the parameters, right? These are the parameters, right? So so if you got a driver that says, okay, I want $3 a mile, I only want to stay home. I want to be home every night. I want $3 a mile, and I want you to gross me 8 to 10,000 a week. Let's say 9,000. At that middle number, 9,000. So 8 to 10 gross a week. I want $3 a mile, but I want to be home every night. So how realistic is that from a dispatcher's perspective? How can I possibly do that for you? So they want $3 a mile, right? I would take the $3 a mile and divide it into that gross weekly, which is, what is that? 9,000. So let me get my calculator up. And this is in the background. So if I'm gonna gross you 9,000 a week, and you want to make at least $3 a mile, that means you got to drive. You got to average about 3,000. How many miles you got to average? 3,000 miles, because you're going to divide the dollar amount, $3 a mile, into how much you want to gross per week, and that'll tell you how much realistically as a dispatcher, or how much you got to drive as a driver. You got to be over the road for X amount of miles to get that, to average that $3 a mile. So if a driver tells you, I want to be home every night and grossing 9,000 at $3 a mile, that's going to be a challenge, right? It's simple math if you do the math, right? So depending on what they want to grow. So let's do a scenario here. Let's continue the scenario. This is the case study, but I'm gonna give you the scenario here. Let's back this up and do the scenario here. This is the use case, right? So let's say the scenario was the driver wants 9,000 gross weekly, right? And let me enlarge this so you guys can see it a little bit better, right? Hopefully that's better. And respond to this real quick. So if they want to do, here's scenario number one. Let me label it. Scenario number one. Gross 9,000, a driver wants gross weekly 9,000, right? And they want $3 a mile, right? $3 a mile. Then, right, let's put a period there. How many miles does the driver need to run in order to gross 9,000 per week, right? And we'll go to number two, but okay. So how many would they need to run? So if you take the gross amount, the dollar amount that they want to gross per week, and you divide it by the rate per mile that they want, that'll tell you how many miles that they need to run, right? So to be gross weekly rate divided by rate per mile equals number of miles needed. Okay, that's number one, right? Well, let's say the driver says, I want $3 a mile, and how much can I make if I drive? How much can I gross weekly if I drive 2,000 or 2,500, miles? If I drive 2,500 miles per week on a 5 or 6 day work week, then how much can I gross per week? Well, now you're just flipping the mathematical equation. You got the gross weekly rate divided by the rate per mile is the miles needed to drive, right? Needed to drive OTR. That's number one, right? The second way you can figure it out, well, how much if you take the cents per mile or the rate per mile, we'll say rate per mile or cents per mile, let's change it to be consistent here. Rate per mile. So if you take the rate per mile and you're driving, let's say, times, let's say 2,500 miles. Let's just give an example, right? Or let's just say, stay consistent. Let's say 2,500 miles per week. Then that will equal the gross weekly rate a driver would make, right? So let's say rate per mile, $3 a mile, let's say 2,500 miles per week. That'll equal a gross amount of, in this case, 7,500, $3 per mile times 2,500 miles. We'll just say, we won't even put 2,500. We just said it as an example. We'll just say miles per week driven, right? Miles per week driven equals the gross weight for the dollar. Now, so we got the number of miles formula, right? We'll bold, underline, and red that. Then we got the gross weekly rate a driver would make. We'll bold, underline that. So now, what else do we need now? Now we need the number of, we got the number of miles, we got the gross weight. Now we need the cents per mile, right? Because we got the other ones. So the cents per mile is what? Is the gross. And let's undo that. This, and this. Gross weekly that the driver is looking to make, gross weekly rate divided by what? The over the road while the miles OTR driven per week equals rate per mile, right? So if you want to gross $9,000 a week and you're driving 2,500 miles, you divide the 9,000 by 2,500, and that'll give you what your average rate per mile will be in that run, right? So let me bold that. So these are the three formulas that you can interchangeably use as a dispatcher to kind of put the driver's numbers in perspective and determine whether or not they're realistic, right? Because you may get a driver say, I want to be home every night. I want to gross 8,000 and I don't want to go no more than 1,000 miles. Well, if you say that, Mr. Carrier, that means that if you're grossing 8,000, if you're only going 1,000 miles, that means 8,000 gross per week divided by 1,000 miles. That means I got to find you loads that's paying $8 a mile to locally. How realistic is that? Unless you are getting them, direct freight from customers that are paying those short runs at that high rate, dedicated, things of that nature, right? So keep these numbers and these formulas in mind, So, but this example one, we figured out 9,000. This example is we're just throwing numbers out there, right? 9,000 grosses weekly, $3 a mile. How many miles does the driver need to run to gross 9,000 a week? You just simply divide the $3 a mile into the 9,000, and that'll tell you it's 3,000 miles, right? And I'll put the answer, right? So how many miles they need to run, right? Number of miles. So the number of miles formula right here for this first question is 3,000 because you're taking the gross weekly rate, in this example, 9,000, and you're dividing it by the rate per mile, $3 a mile. It's going to give you how many miles they need to drive, the driver needs to run in order to gross 9,000 a week is 3,000 miles, right? So we can take all types of scenarios and numbers and plug it into the formulas to get the answers that we need, okay? So, and I just want to make sure you guys kind of get that, right? So that's the gross. So how many miles does the driver need? That's example number one. So we can put in other numbers too, right? So we did the miles. So now what about the gross weekly rate? So you ask your driver before you dispatch for them, what are you looking to gross per week, right? So that'll kind of give you an idea of how you need to structure your dispatching for them, the type of rate per mile that you got to find for them, and then how many miles per week they got to drive to get to that rate per mile, right? So the second one is we got number of miles. So now we want to figure out what are you looking to gross a week? Well, I'm looking to gross. If you're looking to gross $8,000, right? Right. So you would say, okay, well, and then what's your rate per mile? To get to that $8,000. What are you looking to? Well, I want to do at least $250 a mile. The driver said, and this is all dictated in the carrier profile, right? The carrier Carrier profile will tell you the driver's going to give you some upfront data to say, hey, I want to drive, I want to average at least $2.50 a mile, and I want to gross $8,000 a week, right? So, right. Or I want to drive 1,500 miles at $2.50 a mile. So how much does that gross a week? Well, in that case, you just do simple math, right? You just say, if you're going to drive up to 1,500 miles in a week, well, let's say you drive 2,000 miles in a week. You're driving 2,000 miles in a week, and you want to do it at an average of $2.50 a mile. That's going to get you $5,000 because you just do the simple mathematics at that point. You're driving 2,000 miles a week, spread out over 5 to 6 days, and you want to average $2.50 a mile. So you're going to gross, on average, $5,000 because you took 2,000 miles and you multiplied it times $2.50 a mile. That's $5,000. Okay, you just do the math, right? If you want to do $8,000 at $2.50 a mile, how many miles a week you want to, go? So $8,000 you want to gross weekly at $2.50 a mile, right? You just simply, now it's just simple math, right? You take the 8,000 gross and you divide the 250 miles into it. So you 8,000 that you're looking to gross, Mr. Carrier, and you divide by the number of cents per mile. So now you got to run 3,200 miles because 8,000, which is over the standard number of miles on a 5 to 6 day work week that a driver drives. 3,200 is a lot of miles, right? It's possible, but if you're doing, because now the next question is, well, how many miles per day can a driver drive, right? You want to, kind of understand that as well. But this is right here, the answer to this one is 3,200 miles. So if you're doing 3,200 miles in a 5 and 6 day period, what is that average miles per day then? 3,200 over 5 days is you're averaging 640 miles. Is that possible in one day, right? Over 6 days, 3,200 divided by 6 days is 533 miles per day. So are both of those possible? Now you got to get into understanding the drivers. And the drivers will tell you they can drive, if they drive at 60 miles an hour for 11 hours straight, according to their drive time, right? And they can drive, right, over the road before they have to do their resets, right? Then 11 hours times 60 miles an hour, let's say 65 miles an hour on average. And you're not going to be doing that 11 hours straight at 65 miles an hour. Sometimes you're going to slow down, go around turns. But let's say on average, you're doing 65 miles an hour for 11 hours straight times 11. That's 715 miles for that one day you can average. Let's say 60 miles an hour at 11 hours times 11 hours. That's 660 miles. So in both cases, you can probably get to that 3,200, but your driver's going to be humping it though. They're going to be moving, right? So you want to keep that in mind also. Okay. So these are some things that you realistically can consider, but you want to know some of these things as a dispatcher. It puts you at an advantage when you're talking to carriers to understand whether or not the numbers they're giving you are to you realistic in order to look for loads for them, because you're looking for loads at their desired cents per mile and their desired number of miles they're willing to go. If they give you a number that's outside of that realm, you got to explain to them like, well, if you're trying to gross 8,000 a week, Mr. Carrier, with a drive-in, flatbed, or reefer, and you want to average $2.50 a mile. So if you divide that into that, you gotta drive 3,200 miles. You're not gonna get 8,000 in a week at $2.50 a mile, unless you do 3,200 miles, right? So that's how that works. So let's say 8,000 divided by 50. Yeah, 3,200 miles. So these are simple formula numbers that you want to consider as a dispatcher. Now you don't have to become a mathematical wizard at this, but to know some of this stuff is a little bit helpful in order to give your your carriers realistic expectation. So, okay. Let's see one more here. Rate per mile is figured out by the gross, what you're making per week, divided by the number of miles that you drive in that week. So that's your rate per mile over that week, or over the whatever terms it is. The gross rate that you're making, let's say 9,000 divided by $3 a mile, then that's, I'm sorry, 9,000 you're grossing per week divided by you're driving, let's say 3,000 miles in that week. So now you're averaging about $3 per mile, because 9,000 divided by 3,000 is $3 a mile. Okay. So these are the numbers right here, right? So we can do another one too. Okay, rate per mile, things of that nature. So you say 9,000 gross per week. And let's say you drive 3,000 miles divided by 3,000 miles driven in that week. And that could be 5 or 6 day work week, right? And that equals what? $3 per mile. Okay. So anything over 3,000 miles driven in a work week, 5-6 day work week, it's a lot of driving, but it's still feasible. It can be done. It's just a lot more stressors. If you can keep it between 2,500 and 3,000 in a work week, the more days spread out across the work week for those large miles, the less the number is going to be average per day. Okay. So if you're doing 5 or 6 miles in a week and you're doing 3,000 miles, 6 miles is the lesser miles per day will be less than it would for 5 miles. Okay. Just so guys can kind of get that in your system there to kind of understand what I'm saying about that. All right. So, but this is just some information I wanted to just share some tidbits. That's all. Because you want to be able to feel your carrier out and understand whether or not the numbers they're giving you in the carrier profile are actually realistic and attainable, right? And if they're not, then to be able to explain to the carrier in a way that they can kind of like say, okay, yeah, that doesn't make, sense. If I need to, either do more over the road mileage, increase the more miles a truck driver go over the road at a specific fixed cents per mile, then the higher their gross is going to be for that week. That's just common sense, right? The less miles you go at that fixed cents per mile on average, then the less you're going to make, right? Drivers sometimes, I don't want to say they don't understand it, but they overlook in some cases this information, right? But it's useful, and it's for dispatchers to kind of grasp is also a good idea too. So hopefully that this helps you out. The driver says, well, what do you think I can make? What do you think I can gross per week if I drive 2,500 miles a week on a 5 to 6 day work week period with my drive van, and I'm averaging about $3 per mile on those loads? Well, $3 per mile times the 2,500 mile work week, 3 times 2,500 is 7,500. You can get yourself 7,500 gross per week. Now, these are gross numbers, right? Which means that the driver has to pay the dispatcher out of that gross, not net, but gross. Net is after expenses. Gross is before expenses. What are the expenses? What are some common expenses for the drivers? Obviously, number one expense is fuel, right? Diesel fuel, paying your insurance, paying your dispatcher, right? So now it's starting to go down. But what the driver brings home as opposed to what they make overall are very much two different things, because there are expenses prior to what the driver brings home: dispatcher, fuel, insurance, maybe tires, maintenance every so often. But there are fixed costs and there are variable costs. So what does this have to do with dispatching? Is sometimes the dispatcher would need to understand from a very minuscule standpoint, at least this information here to get an idea of whether or not what the driver is asking of you as a dispatcher is realistic for a dispatcher. And if not, you let them know, like, these are not realistic numbers. If you want to gross these numbers, this is what you probably would need to move more closer towards, you know, more over the road driving, maybe increase your cents per mile. We can probably try to get more on the rate per mile for the load. Maybe you can drive more over the road miles, and then you can get a higher gross per week in your cents per mile. More days, 5 to 6 days, 6 to 7 day work week. You know, stay out there longer to generate that. Okay. And this is how you can approach the carriers and speak to them that way as well. So, but this tidbit, thank you. This is Charles with the Exodus Logistics Learning Center, dispatcher one-on-one training for beginners. Just wanted to give some little information for you so that you guys can take that and use it for your dispatching services. Right. Talk to you later.